Mickey Fulp. He's a certified professional geologist and has a 35 years experience as an exploration geologist and analyst searching for economic deposits of base and precious metals, industrial minerals, coal, uranium, oil and gas, and water in North and South America, Europe, and Asia. Mr. Fulp is going to share with us today his thoughts about America's unwinnable and never-ending wars. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me to welcome Mr. Mickey Fulp at the podium.
Well, thank you very much for staying late. And thanks to Jayan and Rajni for inviting me once again. I have a very loud voice, so if I get too loud, I'm going to move the microphone away a bit. Just let me know. This is my third year of attending, and I've noticed one thing. My dress has steadily declined. And some don't recognize me without my Hong Kong made-to-measure suit with a tailor that looks curiously like Albert Liu. But that said, I figure if Rick Rule can wear a Hawaiian shirt to this and blue jeans, so can I. Unfortunately, I just can't jot down a few notes like Rick Rule or Doug Casey in the middle of the day or roll out of bed and give a speech. So I ask you to bear with me for about 30 minutes today. And that said, one thing that is in my bio that Rajni did not mention, I am a libertarian and my motto is, do not tread on me and I will not tread on you. And that has a lot to do with my talk today. First, I want to show of hands to gauge my audience. How many Americans in the audience? And how many Canadians? Wow. So you Canadians, I'm going to talk about Americans today. So maybe you guys would just want to bugger off over to Maloney's and watch reruns on Hockey Tonight. And, you know, you might find a Stanley Cup final where you end up happy, but that's been 25 years. And that was Quebec and Montreal, and I'm not sure if you consider that part of Canada or not. So. Anyway, I hope I didn't rile anybody up too much with that.
People from other countries.
Yeah, how many from other countries? We got India, I know. London, Australia. Where else? Cool. Well, I've been there more than once, about 3 times, in fact. The unwinnable and never-ending war of the United States of America. I'm going to begin with a quote by Marine Major General Smedley Darlington Butler. Now that's a name for a general, is it not? In 1935, and he wrote, "War is a racket, always has been. It's possibly the oldest, easily the most profitable. Surely the most vicious. It is the only one international in scope. It is the only one in which the profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. A racket is best described, I believe, now I don't believe as you know, as something that is not what it seems to the majority of the people. Only a small inside group knows what it is actually about. It is conducted for the benefit of the very few at the expense of the very many. Out of war, a few people make huge fortunes." Americans are citizens of a warring country, we're members of a warring society. We, the people, must accept that war is an integral part of the United States. Our country was founded on war. We have continued to wage war for the absolute vast majority of the 241 years in which we've been a republic. and since we rebelled against a tyrannical form of government by an absolute monarch. Our founding fathers wrote the Declaration of Independence in 1776, went to war against the king and his redcoats. They surrendered in 1783 and established a republic with ratification of the Constitution of the United States of America in 1787. During the 19th century, my country engaged in a series of wars against innumerable Indian tribes, European powers including Britain, France, and Spain, and many neighbors to the south, including Mexico, Uruguay, Paraguay, Brazil, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. All in all, in the 19th century, we fought 63 wars, and our longest tenure without war was from 1890 to 1898, a mere 8 years. Most of these wars are based on a policy called manifest destiny and resulted in consolidation of the coterminous United States as we know it today. But we also battled pirates in the Aegean, Caribbean, and Mediterranean seas, and the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, and attacked Pacific Islanders in such diverse places as Fiji, Gilbert Island, Samoa, Japan, Formosa, and Korea. In the Civil War, which Doug correctly pointed out was not really a civil war, it was a war of secession, we killed more of each other in 5 years. These are our own brothers, to the tune of 750,000 than all of our other wars combined. In the 20th century, the US of A had far fewer but arguably more costly wars. From 1903 to 34, we engaged in regional imperialism with a series of invasions and occupations of 7 countries in the Middle Americas, including Panama, Nicaragua, Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Honduras, and Mexico once again. These were driven by presidential fiat, including the Monroe Doctrine of Manifest Destiny, Teddy Roosevelt's policy of speak softly but carry a big stick, and Woodrow Wilson's platform of democratic nation building. These were aptly called the Banana Wars because they were supported and financed by United Fruit Company about bananas and carried out by the Marine Corps, who actually published a manual in 1921 called The Strategy and Tactics of Small Wars. In 1917, as you know, we belatedly entered World War I, President Wilson's war to end all wars, but really with support of major industrialists who had made windfall profits exporting goods to European countries in the war previous 3 years. This war was overwhelmingly unpopular with the public. And here's an interesting fact I dug up. The U.S. had the 14th largest army in the world before World War I, when we conscripted 2.8 million men. The conflict served to enrich segments of the industrial economy, but at the expense of 117,000 American soldiers who died on foreign soil. In 1919, federal debt totaled $25 billion, and $17 billion of that was still when we went into the Great Depression and the stock market crash of 1929. The aforementioned Marine General Butler was a 2-time Medal of Honor winner during the aforementioned Banana Wars. His book, War is a Racket, condemned the business of war and was the quote I gave. Indeed, this war to end all wars was followed by a 23-year period from 1918 to 1941 that was the most peaceful time since America's founding. But do not forget, nearly half of that was occurred during the Great Depression. Pearl Harbor was bombed on December 7th in 1941. We declared war against the Axis powers. Over the next 4 years, 405,000 Americans lost their lives in Europe and Asia. War ended when we dropped bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. After the Second World War, two superpowers emerged, as we all know, and with diametrically opposed ideological and economic systems. A 45-year Cold War ensued, with a grim consequence of nuclear arms race. It finally ended with the collapse of communism and dissolution of USSR in 1991. In the interim, American capitalism and Soviet Chinese communism squared off in two Asian countries divided by decree after World War II. Two major wars are fought, Korea, which remains unresolved and unsolvable today, as we well know, and Vietnam, along with Cambodia and Laos, from 1965 to 73, a war that ended with reuniting of that country under communist rule in 1975. That's a history of war to Vietnam. Now let's step back to America's greatest generation. We have not won a major armed conflict since the end of World War II in 1945, when we first established a standing army. In his very first speech to the American people as president in April 1953, and again with his farewell speech in January of 1961, lifelong military man and our 34th president, Dwight David Eisenhower, warned us of the dangers of the military-industrial complex. That is, a standing army conjoined with a private armament industry waging war in perpetuity. That's what's happened, folks. What has followed a scant 2 years later and continuing over the next 5.5 decades has been a series of 8 unwinnable wars and mostly, let me say that again, pardon me, a series of 8 unwinnable and mostly never-ending wars started by American presidents. And I'm going to go through these. But first, among those 8, 1 is over and we lost. 5 are ongoing. 1 was never finished and led to another unwinnable war. And 1 ended with a regime change. I think you'll know about 6 of them, but I'm going to pull a couple of rabbits out of the hat here. The Vietnam War was started by John F. Kennedy in 1963, escalated by Lyndon Johnson, who declined to run for re-election in 1968 because of this war, and finally ended with Nixon's withdrawal of American troops in 1973. Our loss was confirmed with the downfall of Saigon during Gerald Ford's tenure in 1975. Over 58,000 American boys lost their lives in this war. John Fitzgerald Kennedy's Vietnam War was America's first unwinnable war. President Johnson's decision to escalate Vietnam into a full-blown war was perhaps not his worst deed. He perpetrated on the American public in 1965 another unwinnable war based on a socialist agenda, the war on poverty and the Great Society. In the 52 years, since that fateful faux pas, American society has not progressed. Instead, it has regressed on nearly every social metric that we have, despite trillions and trillions of dollars spent on government entitlement programs to cure our perceived ills. For example, in 1966, the U.S. government classified 28 million Americans, or 15%, as living below the poverty line. In 2015, that number was 43 million Americans, comprising 13.5% in the poorhouse. Lyndon Baines Johnson's war on poverty is America's second unwinnable war. Not to be outdone, in September 1969, Tricky Dick Nixon started an endless battle of his own design, called the War on Drugs. The war has been devastating to American society, both socially and economically. Its abject failure is illustrated by relatively harmless drug marijuana, which Peter Bell and I just took a trip around the block here before I got up here, and you can't go anywhere in Vancouver without the smell of the sweet leaf. Over 25 million Americans have been arrested for possession of pot since it was made illegal in 1937. Over 100 million Americans now admit to smoking marijuana at some point in their lives, yet it remains illegal on the federal level. Marijuana is now America's largest cash crop, exceeding corn by over 60%. The war on drugs was escalated exponentially during the Reagan years and continued through the terms of Bush Sr., Clinton, and Bush Jr. It has served only to create international drug cartels, crime cartels, and terrorist organizations that control drug growing, processing, production, manufacture, and distribution throughout the world, and especially the United States. Folks, prohibition does not work. Why? Because people like to get high. We now spend over $51 billion every year of our tax dollars fighting the war on drugs. Richard Milhouse Nixon's war on drugs is America's third unwinnable war. Luckily, our next three leaders, Ford, Carter, and Reagan, did not initiate any unwinnable wars. Carter and Reagan both ran on platforms to limit size of the federal government, but neither made any headway on the war on poverty. After 17 years of presidencies with nary an unwinnable war, George H.W. Bush became the next culprit. In August 1990, Iraq invaded and annexed Kuwait, its oil-rich neighbor. Saddam Hussein's actions were met with wide international condemnation. Economic sanctions were initiated by the United Nations, and war preparations began with a UN coalition of 34 countries, led, of course, by the United States. Bombing commenced in January of 1991. Ground troops were deployed 5 weeks later, and the ground war was over in 4 days. American, British, and French forces pursued fleeing Iraqi troops to 240 kilometers from Baghdad before withdrawing at President Bush's orders. He declared a ceasefire, and Saddam's mother of all battles was over. Or was it? President Bush had refused to allow U.S. troops to enter Baghdad and finish off Saddam Hussein and his Republican Guard. Why? I think he had a good reason. When asked for his reasoning, Bush said, "We would have been forced to occupy Baghdad and, in effect, rule Iraq." Defense Secretary Cheney chimed in. "We had achieved our objectives, and we were not going to get bogged down in the problems of trying to take over and govern Iraq." As you well know, those two quotes came back to haunt Bush Jr. and that same Dick Cheney in the mid-2000s. George Herman Walker Bush's Gulf War became America's fourth unwinnable war. In his 1998 State of the Union address, Clinton warned of Saddam Hussein's development of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, the so-called fictitious weapons of mass destruction. And he actually signed a bill for regime change in Iraq. And the last 2 of his years of his tenure, we constantly bombed Iraq. 3 other episodes during Clinton's presidency are of major strategic importance and all involve Al-Qaeda. And those are the World Trade Center bombing in 1993, the 1998 U.S. Embassy bombing of Kenya and Tanzania, and the 2000 suicide bombing of the USS Cole in Yemen. The Sudanese government, little known fact, actually offered to deliver bin Laden to the Clinton administration in 1996, 1998, and year 2000, and provide intelligence on terrorist organizations in the Middle East. However, William Jefferson Clinton ignored these offers, and his failure to take out Osama bin Laden led directly, as you know, to 9/11 in 2001. Therefore, when George W. Bush, Little Bush as I prefer to call him, was sworn in as president in January 2001, the seeds of 3 unwinnable wars have been sown by Clinton: the war on terror, the war in Afghanistan, and the war in Iraq. But make no mistake, Bush Jr. was the man that adopted and nurtured these forever wars as he would have his own progeny. As the 21st century was ushered in with Y2K, that fiasco which we all remember, America was not actively warring, but that all changed 9 months later with the terrorist attacks on September 11th, when 2,605 Americans died. 9 days later, President Bush proclaimed a never-ending battle he called the War on Terror. With these 3 words, originally coined by Ronald Reagan in the 80s, America was plunged into not only an unwinnable war, but a perpetual, endless, forever Orwellian-style war. George Walker Bush's War on Terror is America's 5th unwinnable war. Little Bush said at the time of 9/11, either you are with us or you're against us. And he probably said it with about that accent. Therefore, he invaded Afghanistan October 2001, overthrew the Taliban government, destroyed al-Qaeda camps, and installed a new regime. Taliban was removed by power, but subsequently they made a very strong resurgence in many parts of the country. Since 2006, Afghanistan's opium production has grown to an estimated 90% of world supply. Where's the rest of it come from? Mostly from Mexico and the drug cartels. After 13 years of war, he finally declared victory and withdrew American troops at the end of 2014. But by the next October, President Obama resumed war operations, and the U.S. will permanently maintain 2 bases with nearly 10,000 military personnel in Afghanistan indefinitely. At this junction, the once defeated Taliban now occupies about 20% of a country composed of tribal warlords, with al-Qaeda and Islamic State controlling numerous enclaves. Collateral to the world and to the war in Afghan territory, the U.S. began drone strikes and incursions across the frontier in northwest Pakistan in 2004. We killed Osama bin Laden in 2011. Of course, military actions also continue there. George Walker Bush's war in Afghanistan is America's 6th unwinnable war. But the big war in Afghanistan was not enough for the powerful neocons, including Dick Cheney and Little Bush's administration. In 2003, the United States invaded and occupied Iraq on the false pretense established by Clinton that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. Well, they didn't exist, but it was an excuse to finish what Big Bush did not do: remove the dictator of yet another country cobbled together at the end of World War I with Saddam's ruling Sunni party minority, the Shiites in the south, and the ethnic Kurds to the north. We destroyed the Sunni party. Saddam was captured and executed. Civil war ensued. A Shia government was installed, and U.S. withdrew troops at the end of 2011, turning the civil war over to the Iraqis. Since the retreat from Iraq, government forces disposed Sunnis, Iranian-backed Shia factions, and ethnic Kurds have repeatedly clashed in sectarian violence in the northern part of the country. By 2014, this had merged with a civil war in Syria. The chaos in Iraq that began with the American invasion in 2003 has begotten the radical Islamic State, call it ISIS, ISIL, or Daesh, or whatever, which now controls large swaths of northern Iraq and Syria. U.S. bombings and drone strikes continue in a regional war in Iraq, Syria, Libya, Algeria, and Afghanistan, and many other countries. Much like the decade-long quagmire in the putrid jungles of Vietnam, there is no end in sight for secular civil wars in the stinking deserts of the Middle East. They are simply the next chapter in American Encyclopedia of Never-Ending War. George Walker Bush's Iraq War is America's 7th unwinnable war. In January 2009, we elected Democrat Barack Obama, sworn as the 44th president, ending 8 years in Republican rule. He came to office advocating an end to the Iraq War in 18 months and closure of the Guantanamo Bay detention camp within a year. Obama employed disturbing Orwellian newspeak by ordering the Pentagon to discard the term war on terror. Now it's called overseas contingency operations. He also directed that the term the war on drugs no longer be used. Despite accelerating the war in Afghanistan, Obama was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in October 2009. In a 36-minute speech, the man said war 44 times. He said peace 36 times. So channeling Orwell's first slogan of the party displayed on the white facade of the Ministry of Truth, Obama has asked us to believe that war is peace. But Obama did not bring peace. Instead, he declared his own war, the war on capitalism. His domestic agenda included government health care, increased entitlement programs, redistribution of wealth, higher taxes, increasingly burdensome regulation of business and free enterprise, taxpayer bailouts of banks and large corporations, creation of vast amounts of fiat currency, monetization of debt, restrictions on individual rights, surreptitious spying on ordinary citizens, and failed attempts, lucky for us, to restrict our right to bear arms. After 8 years of this president who embraced a socialistic agenda, the American people elected an avowed capitalist to succeed him. I really don't need to explain to this audience the inevitable failings of socialism, collectivism, and statism, but we won this one with a regime change. Barack Hussein Obama II war on capitalism was America's 8th unwinnable war. Since Ike's warning in early '61, our elected leaders have not heeded the sage old warrior's advice against war and for peace. We have now waged 8 unwinnable and never-ending wars that continue to take the lives of our fine young men. That dead number now stands at 65,000 913 and counting in the intervening 55 years. 1972 presidential candidate George McGovern said, "I'm fed up to the ears with old men dreaming up wars for young men to die in." Unfortunately, this World War II Air Force pilot and anti-war populist was defeated soundly by disgraced Dick Nixon in a landslide in 1972, and our warring ways have continued since then. In addition to the tragic cost in lives, there is also a huge financial cost to war. Massive debt was incurred to finance the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I, and World War II. Government debt load, total government debt load now with respect to GDP is at 107%, exceeded only by 119% in 1946. Although the economic crisis of 2008 and 2009 are mostly to blame, a significant portion is directly attributable to the cost of waging our forever war on terror. And now President Trump is asking for a $60 billion bump in military spending for 2018. In summary, and I've got about 1 minute to go, the United States of America has fought in 90 wars since its Declaration of Independence. Despite a constitutional requirement, and you will notice I do not go anywhere with my Declaration of Independence and U.S. Constitution. I thank Laura Stein for that idea. We have only declared war 5 times. That is required by the Constitution. We declare war in 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, and World War II. America was founded on war, and there is little doubt in my mind that we will be at war for the duration of our republic. And we will endure until the greatest nation on earth crumbles under a burden of debt and financial ruin that comes from waging never-ending war. I think the decorated warrior turned pacifist General Butler said it best. There are only 2 things we should fight for. One is the defense of our homes, and the other is the Bill of Rights. All I am saying is, why can't we give peace a chance? Thank you very much.